Ok. Boa tarde a todos. Eu gostaria de cumprimentar, em primeiro lugar, todos os presentes, organizadores, palestrantes e público, nesse pré-evento que procura ampliar, num primeiro momento, pelo menos, o foco das atuais preocupações. Todos nós estamos preocupados com o problema das cidades sustentáveis, e esse problema será discutido longamente no ano que vem, no evento de 2023. Hoje, eu sugeri colocar essa temática urbana no panorama mais amplo, né, no panorama maior da sustentabilidade global do planeta. A razão desse foco ampliado é simples, quase óbvia. Afinal, é nas cidades que se tomam as decisões políticas e econômicas, e nas cidades que estão os líderes que já planejam hoje o fornecimento de matérias-primas do próximo ano, e nas cidades que se compram e vendem commodities, e são esses planos e interesses que influem nas opiniões e nas expectativas, criando aquela permissividade que resulta nos desmatamentos e na destruição do bioma, no empobrecimento da diversidade das espécies animais e vegetais e na deteriorização das condições climáticas. É claro que em países como o Brasil, urbanistas e arquitetos têm problemas muito imediatos a resolver. Eles se defrontam com inúmeros problemas mais concretos que se colocam em todas as esquinas das cidades. Eles lidam com uma população enorme vivendo em bairros carentes, com infraestruturas pouco decentes, e as crises dos últimos anos resultaram em números crescentes de seres humanos caindo na pobreza total, de forma que se encontram fora das malhas da sociedade propriamente dita. Mesmo assim, não podemos esquecer que são justamente os mais pobres que serão mais afetados pelas mudanças climáticas e, por sua vez, pelas opiniões, né, que prevalecem e se afirmam nas cidades. Essa é a razão porque teremos hoje duas falas preliminares sobre a saúde do planeta. Isso, Tony Hiss vai falar sobre isso, e a conservação da natureza brasileira, que Denise Garcia é uma especialista. E isso antes de abordarmos as questões do planejamento das cidades. Ambos autores falam dessas tarefas num tom bastante otimista e proativo. Ambos mostram o que pode ser feito para melhorar o atual mal-estar e remediar o caminho insustentável que foi trilhado nos últimos anos. E com isso, já introduzo os nossos palestrantes, Ladies First, Denise Garcia, representante da ONG TNC, The Nature Conservancy. Ela coordena, né, o ramo brasileiro, né, das ciências da TNC. A TNC atua também em outros lugares do mundo. Ela é doutora em ecotoxicologia pela Universidade de Montreal, tem experiência nas áreas mais diversas, conservação das águas, ecologia, análise de paisagem, e ela atuou em inúmeras regiões, né, do arquipélago ártico e da floresta boreal do Canadá até a Amazônia, a Mata Atlântica e o Cerrado brasileiros. E assim ela lida com assuntos como mudanças climáticas, desmatamento, incêndios florestais, biogeoquímica, bioacumulação de contaminantes e coisas desse gênero. Então, tudo isso faz de Denise uma interlocutora ideal para o nosso outro convidado, que vai falar em primeiro lugar, Tony Hiss. Ele é jornalista e professor, autor de inúmeros livros, entre os quais eu queria destacar Rescuing the Planet, né? Salvar o planeta, protegendo metade do território para poder curar, né, o planeta Terra. É um livro que foi premiado, né, que saiu pouco tempo atrás e já foi premiado. Ele foi redator da prestigiosa revista The New Yorker por 30 anos e professor visitante na Universidade de Nova York durante um longo período de 25 anos. E agora ele é consultor em questões de planejamento e conservação no mundo inteiro. O terceiro desse trevo é Charles Duff, já conhecido aqui no Brasil, ele já esteve aqui em Porto Alegre 2 vezes. Ele é urbanista, pesquisador e historiador, além de um visitante muito bem-quisto na nossa cidade. Ele se ocupa, né, de planejamento das cidades, do trânsito, da conservação de partes históricas e da integração da conservação com o planejamento de partes novas. Ele foi formado no Amherst College, na Business School em Harvard, e foi presidente da Baltimore Architecture Foundation, e ele é autor de um belo livro que se chama The North Atlantic Cities. E, last but not least, Marcos Tomazelli. Ele é professor e doutor pela Universidade Técnica de Viena, também já conhece bem o Brasil, tem colaboração com a PUC e a URGS. Atualmente ele dirige o Instituto de Desenho Urbano e Arquitetura Paisagística em Viena. Ele tem experiência na área de arquitetura, urbanismo, planejamento de projeto do espaço urbano, com ênfase em cidades e assentamentos humanos sustentáveis. Ele trabalha sobre revoluções urbanas e habitação social no contexto europeu, africano, na América Latina também. E, para não me alongar muito, eu queria apenas agradecer ao CDEA, ao nosso Centro de Estudos Europeus e Alemães, e aos seus representantes e diretores, o Drayton Gonzaga, a Sandra Einloft, que é da Escola Politécnica, a professora Cláudia Lima Marques, a Cristiane Kilian, o Paulo, aqui presente, que sempre nos ajuda, e a Vini Ferreira, que todos colaboraram para o bom funcionamento desse nosso pré-evento hoje. Então, com isso, eu já passo a palavra para o Tony Hiss. Tony Hiss, you have the word now. You have to put on your audio.
Apologies. Thank you so much, Catherine. It's an honor to be with you all today. I'm so excited by the prospect of North America and South America beginning to think together about the problems that face us all. I'm going to show you some pictures of some of the things we've done right up in the north and some of the things we've done wrong. We have so much to learn from each other. This is a very exciting moment. And 2 days ago, the human population reached 8 billion people for the first time in history. A day ago, your president-elect received a hero's welcome at the climate conference in Egypt, and was told that he was the star of the conference and brought a much-needed feeling of hope to a conference that seemed to be floundering. So this is the great moment for us to begin to think together. And I'm so happy to be with you. Let me just pull up some slides. Start the slideshow. My book, as Catherine mentioned, is called Rescuing the Planet, but the subject of your conference is sustainability. Sustainability was defined succinctly 35 years ago by the United Nations as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. What I'm trying to write about is adding in the needs of other species. Now that 1 million species of plants and animals are at risk of extinction in the near future, and now that we know for sure that it is the life around us, the other lives that keep us going. Without them, we wouldn't have enough oxygen to breathe or enough food to eat. It's sometimes called the biodiversity crisis or the extinctions crisis. We're losing animals, many of which are beloved. This was the last northern white rhino, male white rhino, who met his demise a few years ago in the company of his beloved keeper. It's the crisis that so far keeps getting overshadowed by the climate crisis, which itself keeps getting overshadowed by everything else. Next month, the world will gather in Montreal to pick a new environmental goal. It looks as though they will endorse the idea of what's called 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the land and waters of the planet by the year 2030. Although the science tells us what we really need is 50%. These losses have given rise to a new word in the English language, endling, meaning the very last of its species. I'm not sure what the Portuguese equivalent would be, something more like terminando. Endling is a word that combines both end and dwindling, the sense of something reaching an end. This was Solitary George, Lonesome George as he was called, or Solitario Jorge in Spanish, the last Pinta Island giant tortoise on in the Galapagos, who died a few years ago at the age of 101, leaving no descendants behind. Back after the Civil War in the United States, there was an enormous move to begin to industrialize the entire country and to move into the parts of it that had not been settled. And there was this general notion that the way to do this was to begin with subtraction before you went to addition. In other words, you had to subtract everything that had been there, the people, the wildlife, even the landscape, before you could add something else like the settlers. And this picture, this painting from 1872 called American Progress, shows a foot figure named Columbia, who was then thought of as the female personification of the US, floating across the continent. In her elbow, she has a crook. In her crook of her elbow, she has a loop of telegraph wire, which is playing out behind her. And as it does so, railroads and settlers come in her wake. And in front of her, Native Americans, buffaloes, a snarling bear are retreating into the darkness. Interestingly, that very same year, 1872, that's now 150 years ago, America protected its first national park, Yellowstone National Park. The size of 3 Rhode Islands, our smallest states, 2 million acres in all. So then, on the one hand, you had development thinking that it had the right to go anywhere and do anything. On the other hand, the idea of conservation began to be established as a force in the landscape. Now, it too had its drawbacks in those days because it too was based on a faulty notion of subtraction. The Native Americans were removed, the landscape remained. The good side of this is that it's given rise to 6,000 national parks in 100 countries around the world and another 100,000 protected landscapes. We also began to produce something even more extraordinary to my way of thinking. This is a man named Benton Mackay, best remembered as the father of the Appalachian Trail, which stretches along the tops of the mountains on the east coast of US from Maine all the way to Georgia. The way this came about was that the summer Benton Mackay graduated from college, and that was in the year 1900. He and a friend bushwhacked their way up a mountain in Vermont. There were no trails in those days, shinning up the tallest trees they could find. And while he was swaying there, young Benton Mackay suddenly had the thought, the idea, that he was in a single place that stretched all the way from Maine to Georgia along this mountain range. Later, he called it a planetary feeling. And it was from this that he then, 20 years later, published a piece about the possibility of a trail. And that trail came into being in the next 12 years, almost entirely the work of volunteers on weekends. The largest public works in human history that I know of, entirely constructed by volunteers. But Mackay always thought the trail was just part of what he had in mind, part of his vision. The rest was what he called a realm surrounding the mountains from north to south. And here's what North America looks like, seen from afar. And we do have the virtue of good bones as a continent in North America. In other words, we've got mountains running up the east side on the right side of the screen, and mountains, the Rocky Mountains, running up the west side. Up the top is the extraordinary boreal forest of Canada, the largest intact landscape left in the world, even more intact than the Amazon at this point. And then down in the south is a newly identified hotspot of biodiversity, the North America Coastal Plain Biodiversity Hotspot. So we're lucky, it's easy to keep the continent in mind because it has this structure that's been bequeathed to us by the planet. The Yellowstone idea, although it was of immense importance, we realized some years ago was not doing the perfect job in terms of retaining species. Species wandered around. They didn't recognize the borders that humans had created. And if growth began to development around these parks, once they left, it was hard for them to get back in. We needed another way of protecting. Meanwhile, the whole concept of half Earth was coming into being. And the science that backs it up says that in order really to maintain most of the life forms, we need to protect something close to half the Earth. That doesn't mean kicking people out, but it does mean the people there have to share the landscape with other life forms. And the reason that's so important is that the world has reached the point now where about 15% of the planet is protected. But in the long run, the science shows that will only allow us to retain about 25% of the other life forms or less. Whereas if we bump that figure up to 50%, then at least 85 to 90% of all the other species can survive. Not everything, but most everything. That's worth repeating. If we can protect in some form or other about half of the landscape and half of the oceans, then 85 to 90% of the other species with which we share this planet, the species we rely on, as I said earlier, for food and for air to breathe, can themselves survive. I'd like you to look into the steely gaze of this man, whose name was Vladimir Yovanovich Vernadsky, a brilliant Russian geochemist from the early 20th century, who wrote the first comprehensive book about the biosphere. Interestingly, Vernadsky is revered in both Russia and Ukraine, but still where he's thought of as another Darwin, another Einstein, still not so well known in the Western Hemisphere. It was Vernadsky that pointed out that the biosphere, this container of living matter, is ancient. It goes back almost to the beginning of the planet Earth itself. It's robust. It has produced innumerable life forms. It's abundant. It's huge, seen side to side, but it has this third dimension, or rather almost this lack of a third dimension. From top to bottom, most species live between the top of Mount Everest and the bottom of the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean. That's a distance of only 12.5 miles. And as an Englishman pointed out, laid flat on the ground, that's a distance you could easily drive over on a decent road in 20 minutes or less. So the biosphere is not a sphere at all. It's a coating resting on top of the sphere. So we live within this, but it has this ancientness, it has this robustness, it has this hugeness, but top to bottom, it also has this thinness. This vulnerability is built into the whole apparatus. And we have to make sure that everything we do doesn't make it any thinner. Now, the boreal forest that I mentioned before, this extraordinary landscape that still exists in its immenseness across the top of North America, stretching from Alaska all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. The Canadian government, although it did not behave any better towards its Native Americans than the US government did, nevertheless did one thing better, and that was it never kicked them off the land. Now they're there, and the Canadian government is turning to them and asking them to become the guardians and stewards of a whole new second set of national parks. They will become, as they say, the moccasins and mucklucks on the ground. So as these parks are coming into being, enormous tracts of land, some of them 10 times the size of Yellowstone National Park, the indigenous people of Canada are becoming the rangers and guardians. This is an extraordinary development, and it will allow Canada to reach its own goal of 30% protection within the next 7 years, something they could never hope to have attained without the assistance and partnership with the indigenous people. In the 1990s, a Canadian activist and lawyer named Harvey Locke became the sort of latter-day Benton Mackay, and he had a vision that the Rocky Mountains constituted a single place, stretching from Yellowstone all the way up to the northern end of the Yukon. And he's put together a coalition of people, Yellowstone to Yukon, or Y to Y, and in their first 25 years, were able to increase by 80% the amount of protected areas in Y to Y, and now they are partnering with, for the first time, with indigenous groups to create a whole new system of protected areas within Y to Y. As you'll see from these circles, that's where the new indigenous protected areas will come into being to supplement the ones the Canadian government and provincial governments have set up. Another thing we've started to do better in North America is to realize that the giant highways we built are a great post-war infrastructure project, separated species. They couldn't get across. It acted almost like a wall or a corral. But that it is possible to reunite the landscape simply by putting an overpass over the highway that's only for animals, or underpasses under the highway that are only for animals. They will use them. And that idea is suddenly catching on all over the US and Canada. Another idea is that we can put together landscapes, connect them up, and here's a map that's been shown of how the natural areas that still exist in Florida could be connected together. And another people and friends of mine in the Wilderness Society are thinking about how the whole continent can be reconnected. Now, we're still running up against that old development urge, which hasn't lessened, and large sort of city regions are coming into being. They've been given the name mega regions. This map was from 2008 of emerging mega regions in the US. This is an updated map from this year showing they've gotten even bigger. How are we going to reconcile that kind of growth with the landscape? That's a huge problem that I hope we can think together as a hemisphere about. People are trying to do things. Here are a map of the two counties north of Manhattan, north of New York City, the two richest suburban counties anywhere in the US. Part of it's in New York State, Westchester County, part of it's in the state of Connecticut, Fairfield County. Believe it or not, a group of 40 or so conservation groups within that area have banded together and are calling themselves not Y2Y, but H2H, meaning they stretch from the Housatonic River on the right to the Hudson River, the Great Hudson River on the left. And they've taken as their goal to protect 50% of that landscape within the next 20 to 30 years. Another way we can reconnect suburbs that's suddenly catching on in North America is the idea that if people can change just a little bit of their lawns into areas that have native plants that attract pollinators, we can reconnect all the pollination and bring that back into the urban and suburban landscape. Some insects, as this little chart on the left shows, need to find a plant that's similar to what they need within 500 feet of where they are. Others, like monarch butterflies, can travel 11 miles before they have to feed again. Another thing's going on, which we hadn't expected, and that's beginning to think more deeply about the kind of species that live with us in the world. We now know that gorillas are highly intelligent. They can laugh, they can grieve, they have rich emotional lives. They can think about the past and the future. More astonishingly, we now know that octopuses are seriously clever. They are tool users. They can build cities. They feel pain. They can solve complex puzzles. And just this year, we've had a report that bees, whose brains are no bigger than a poppy seed, nevertheless have a rich inner world, unique perception. They think, enjoy, and suffer as we do. As one writer has written, the implications of this is that we live within a vast sea of sentience. And the implications of that are clear. On the one hand, every acre of green counts, and on the other hand, there is no such thing as vacant land or an empty lot. It may be empty of human structures, but it is teeming with life. And if we're going to build there, we have to learn how to think in terms of an all-species design that fulfills our needs and also sustains the needs and requirements of the other species. So it's such a pleasure to be with you today, even if only by digital means. I wish I were there in person, because you have an extraordinary city that's 31% open space. And right next door, you have a bountiful and extraordinary landscape, rich biodiversity. So it seems to me we're perfect partners, and it's time to get busy. As I said, Lula made a knockdown, drag-out appearance at COP27 yesterday to announce that Brazil is back, to announce that he will stop deforestation of the Amazon by the year 2030, and that he will stop the degradation of all our biomes. It's time to act, he said, to stop the rush to the abyss. So now the two continents of North America and South America can find each other and think together about keeping life alive, just as you are able to gaze across the lake at sunset. Now we can all ponder this thing, this great structure of life that enfolds us and that needs our help so urgently. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. This was a very emotional speech of yours. And thank you for going into even our city, which you don't yet know, and we hope you will know soon. So I now give the word to Edenise for her talk. Do you have o microfone, Edenise? Ativar o microfone.
Okay.
Pronto, agora
Okay.
sim.
Just put in my presentation. Do you prefer me to present in English?
Yes, I think that's the best in English.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for this opportunity to make this presentation in this forum. And as you mentioned, my talk will be about going from one stream to another, from the Amazon and through the high Arctic, to environments where I have lived and have opportunity, the great opportunity to live and to work, and I'm keen to help to protect. So, well, when you talk about cities, sustainability in cities, we can forget that the Earth is a huge open system. So what happens in cities, in countries, what people do have impacts on ecoregions, wherever they are, even in remote areas as the Arctic or the Amazon, affect the biodiversity, the water, affect the climate, and by the way, is as a feedback loop. All these actions, human actions, are also affected by climate. So sustainability is also about connection. And what happens in a region doesn't stay in that region anymore. So we need to keep that in mind, that we are really in an open system. And the world growth, world population growth is key for sustainability. And we need to find ways to conciliate so many people with a same space. People continue increase despite of COVID losses, but the space we have on Earth is always the same. And we have these projections of 10 billion people by 2050, and we reached yesterday or the day before, sorry, the 80 billion mark. And the projections initially had this estimated for 2023. So we are already a little bit in advance in the population increase. So one point that is important to note is that the Earth planet, from different perspectives, as I mentioned, is the same. The area of the planet doesn't increase, but and let me put this here. The human footprint is being increasing year by year. We have people. Each people need more space to supply its own needs. So these are some estimates from the WWF on the average human ecological footprint. So it takes 2.7 hectares per person right now to supply its needs. And this is 1.5 higher or 50% higher than the Earth's capacity. So Earth's capacity would be 1.8 hectares per person. And we are already, as we say in Portuguese, using, well, we don't use that much anymore, but using the cheque especial or going beyond the Earth capacity. And this has important consequences in terms of the resources. So sorry, here is in Portuguese, but if you consider, I try to at least here to put the axis in English, as if you consider the number of Earths that we need to supply our needs if we continue growing and we continue consuming as we do right now, by 2050, we will need 3 Earths to support our consumption. So it's clear that it's not sustainable. And here we have this need is separated by different elements, and biodiversity in blue, the beauty area, forest area, fish resources, pasture land, biocombustible, biofuels, cultivate areas, and carbon. So we can see that our ecological footprint is increasing incessantly since the 60s, and it will continue increasing. So that makes us think that something needed to change. And all this consumption, all this unsustainable use of the Earth's resources have consequences in terms of climate. And we are seeing right now, this is that very known graph from the IPCC, the projection AR6, and we see that climate variation in terms of surface temperature have been increased in the last century, especially in the last decades. So it's, and this we have here, for the sake of comparison, if we don't have the human or anthropic influence, just natural one, solar and volcanic, what temperatures should be, and what indeed they are, and this is more current. And as a consequence of this climate changes, and not only temperature increasing, we have lots of tipping points that could be started. So the risks are on different fronts, risks of melting in different cold regions, risks of ocean circulation change, or risks of biome loss. And these are in all continents. It's not something that is just in the north and more developed hemisphere. But as I mentioned, we are in an open system, and what happens in one side, in one region, is affecting what happens in the other one. And all this is connected. So when you look at changes in the Arctic sea ice, with a reduction of this ice sheet, this has implications on ocean temperature and density, and a slowdown in water circulation that will influence different areas. So things are really linked, and tipping points are as well. So what is bad can be worse because of this feedback looping on different components of the biosphere. And in terms of the Arctic, we have the most close tipping point. There are predictions that in 20 years, or by 20, a little bit more, by 2050, we'll be losing the ice cover during the summer, completely losing the ice cover in the Arctic Ocean during the summertime. And what happens in the Arctic is comes from different sources. So we have the sea ice melting from the top, influenced by atmospheric processes. And we have the sea ice melting from the bottom. This because the ocean temperature is increasing. So the currents that go to the Arctic are causing the depletion of the ice sheet. And interesting to note that this comes either from the Atlantic, either from the Pacific Ocean. So this warming is attacking the Arctic from both sides, let's say. And besides that, it's not showing here, but we have the atmospheric currents and the hydrological currents, the rivers in general from the North Hemisphere runs toward the Arctic. So besides the warmer temperatures and the ice melting, the Arctic also receives lots of contaminants, atmospheric contaminants, because of the either by water, either by the atmospheric currents. So these atmospheric contaminants will end up being deposited during the Arctic spring. There is massive deposition, for example, of mercury. And this contaminant that can be natural, but in general is from anthropic source or anthropic activities. These contaminants comes to the Arctic and are deposited there, and will impact the whole food chain and the lives of those that live in the Arctic. And if you look at the evolution of the Arctic sea ice area, we can see that in average, in the last 40 years, there was a loss of approximately 2 million square kilometers of sea ice cover. So this is the average here. The scenario is a little bit worse when we look at the winter, the summer time, and a little bit more less bad, but still negative trend in area during the cold time, the winter time. So the Arctic, unfortunately, is being highly affected by activities that did not occur in the Arctic, and they are reducing the ice cover, reducing the layer of ice in the oceans, and affecting the most susceptible ones, especially polar bears that are emblematic of this ice cover loss, because they depend on, in general, on aquatic mammals and fishes, and they go from one piece of ice to another during the summer to fish, to eat, and with the loss of this ice cover, their food is really limited, and they pose a risk of extinction. And also the communities that live in the Arctic, because there are people also there. So we can't forget the Inuits have been there for millennia, and they are also being affected. Their way of life, their traditions are being changed because things that arrive in other places of the planet that end up affecting the Arctic region. But on the other side, as I mentioned, this connectivity exists for the tipping points, and what happens in the Arctic also affects what happens in the Amazon region. So going from one extreme to another, when we have ice melting, we have changes in the Atlantic and also in Pacific, but in the Atlantic is more evident. We have this change in ocean circulation. With this, we have warmer water, especially in the tropical North Atlantic. And this warmer water will affect the Amazon region by provoking frequent droughts. So this is an external factor that affects the Amazon, but if it was not enough, we ourselves contributed directly from inside the forest. So the forest loss, the forest degradation by selective logging, or the degradation by fires end up results in less rainfall, in hotter and longer dry season. So this is not, these consequences are not the same in all regions of the Amazon. We have, depending on the part of the Amazon, we can have less precipitation and the longer dry season, and others we can have higher precipitation, for example. But in general, the areas where deforestation and fires are very common, the main consequence is this reduction in precipitation and increasing temperature in the length of the dry season. And we are talking about the rainforest. So having a much longer dry season implies brings consequences to an ambience or biodiversity that is not used to that lack of precipitation or humidity. And talking about these disturbances, we can compare what happens when we have undisturbed tropical forest, rainforest, and rainforest that becomes a degraded pasture land. So in undisturbed natural pristine area, we have higher humidity and more rainfall. So we have, in average, in the Amazon, 2.4 meters or 2014 millimeters, 400 millimeters per year of precipitation in average. We have a daily evapotranspiration of 3.5 millimeters, and in the degraded area, this evapotranspiration reduces to less than half or even 1/3 of the what we find in natural forest. We have stronger water recycling because the forest is there. The forest evapotranspires and generates water to the atmosphere, generate currents of water that goes to other places besides the Amazon. So what happens in the Amazon also impacts what happens in part of the Cerrado in Patagonia and parts of the South America. So this water generation in the Amazon is key for other ecoregions. But once we lost the forest, once we have a degraded forest, we will be losing rainfall, and depend on the area, 10-20%. Will increase, like I mentioned, temperatures, the length of the dry season. Important to mention that in the rainforest, the root system is very deep, so it's able to look for the water in the soil, deep in the soil. But when you transform that forest, exuberant forest, in a pasture land, and in general degraded pasture land, we lost this pump, let's say, of water coming from the soils. So unfortunately, what we have now is that the image of progress is that in the Amazon region and in the other large forests in the world, is that of the forest being replaced by commodity. So we have this example recently during this government, where development was associated by more commodities, especially pasture lands and soil fields. And also development in these regions is associated with infrastructure projects, either hydroelectric dams, roads, bridges, mining. And what we see more and more is the loss of this dense, rich, biodiverse forest that becomes a barren land, a barren pasture, a degraded pasture. And in the Amazon region, the Brazilian Amazon occupies an area of, originally occupies an area of more than 500 million hectares. But already 20% of this has been converted, especially to pasture. And we can see here, can have here an idea about the length of the deforestation. Of course, here we have the impression that there is no forest in between these deforested areas, but of course there are lots of fragmented forests that becomes more and more susceptible. You know, each time we have a small fragment of forest, that fragment is prone to, is susceptible to an effect of a border effect, edge effect, that will affect the health of that forest. And after a certain time, that forest can be completely lost. So degradation and fragmentation opens, give place to loss, to degradation, to loss, complete loss of the fragments. And but it's not also the forest that is being affected. You know, Amazon is not just about trees, it's also and a lot about water. And what we see more and more are rivers that are being completely affected by mining activities. At this point, mining activities occupy more than 200,000 hectares in the Amazon region. But the point we can say, oh, it's much less than deforestation. But the impact of mining is much more spread, because the water bodies are connected. So once I have a degraded stream or river upstream, everything that is downstream will be affected as well. So mining impacts, and you know, especially artisanal gold mining, they use lots of mercury for gold amalgamation, and these have huge consequences in terms of human health, because mercury can be transformed in an organic form that is very toxic and can be bioaccumulated and can be bioamplified. That means if I have, for example, a concentration of one unit in the water, when it comes to a large predatory fish, that concentration can be increased by 1 million. I can have 1 million more than what I have in the water. Consequently, the humans feeding on that fish will be susceptible to mercury contamination issues. And well, as I mentioned, Amazon is being taken by cattle, in parts by soybean, infrastructure, development, but it's not completely lost. Far from that, we still have a place to do something. And one of these things is about restoration opportunities. So the Amazon, and you can see these clear yellow dots, these are areas with less than 10 years of abandonment, that has areas that have been restored, naturally regenerate. And here you can have an idea in the Amazon, if you consider just this area, this age of regeneration, we have around 2.5 million hectares of potential for restoration. So what happens is that, and this is why the 6 to 10 years is shown here in, is being a focus here, is that at a certain point, the old secondary forests don't get that old. The forests that are being regenerated don't get that old. They are cut before. So up to 5 years of regeneration by law, with the legal permission, that area can be deforested. But after 6 years, it is considered a secondary forest. So it's protected by law, even if not many people cares about the law, but they are officially protected. But what happens is that to go farther than this 10-year threshold is a challenge, because people see in that areas for secondary forests with a lower timber value, etc., as opportunities for more land to become a pasture. But when you look at restoration opportunities, we can have many aspects in terms of these opportunities. We can consider areas, and this is a study done by Amazonia 2030 this year, and we can consider areas with high opportunity or potential, socioeconomic potential, that areas, if restored, will benefit lots of traditional and local communities. We have restoration priorities in terms of mitigation of climate change. We have restoration potential in terms of conservation of biodiversity. And we have also sorry, here is not revenues, is costs of opportunities in terms of costs of restoration. So there are areas where to restore, and in general, we are talking about the natural regeneration. There are areas where natural regeneration is easier to occur because they have a genetic bank, that means a forest around, so it's easier to have seeds and to have this natural regeneration. But we also have areas that are degraded that can be transformed, not exactly in forest, but in agroforest systems. And the TNC, for example, work a lot with in projects on agroforestry. And these projects, in general, target small landholders, because what happens in the Amazon and Pará state in particular is that a big part of deforestation is done by smallholders. I would say in average 30 to 40%, it depends on the year, is done in small properties. That means properties inside the settlements or outside settlements, and with less than 300 hectares. And it's not because they are large deforesters, it's because the number of small properties is much bigger than the number of large properties or medium-sized properties. So in average, depending on the region, a smallholder will deforest 0.1 hectare per year. It's really a small piece of land, or in some regions, 0.4 hectares. But because they are many, in terms of total deforestation, that counts a lot. So change the paradigm that leads to deforestation in smallholders is very important to fight deforestation. And in general, this deforestation is associated to cattle ranching. So the small landholder will deforest a small portion of its land, will put cattle, but they won't have technical assistance or resources to maintain that pasture land. And as a consequence, a few years later, that pasture will be degraded and they will need to open another piece of land. And this will continue if they don't have other alternative opportunities of production. And cocoa agroforestry is a great opportunity because cocoa is native of the Amazon and it is scheduled to develop. So it has companion trees, native companion trees. Well, it can start with banana tree, cassava, and other things, but the native trees will be planted as well, and they will grow eventually. And here we have an area that in a small property that used to be a pasture land, abandoned, and degraded. Here, the area is being already treated, but it used to be degraded. And here, 6 years later, what it is looking like? It's like it's a forest-like system, like agroforestry system. And there are opportunities also for agricultural intensification. So pastures occupy almost 57 million hectares, and of these, approximately 25 millions are degraded. So this degraded pasture, in general abandoned, could be used either for intensification of cattle, sustainable intensification, a few from in average less than 1 head per hectare to 2 to 3 heads or animals per hectare, and or also degraded pasture land could be used for soybean instead of spending over natural forests. And the last opportunity I'm talking about is the bioeconomy opportunities. There are lots of products in the Amazon, and sorry, the slide is in Portuguese, but products like açaí, andiroba, angico babaçu, and I could read, they stopped here, but there are much more than that. Products that can be used as food, as pharmacological components, cosmetics, for handcraft, oil, among other uses. So there are huge opportunities. This is already generate huge source of revenue, especially for local people, for indigenous people, and it's a way to value the standing forest. If you need some intelligence of territorial occupation, the use for bioeconomy is one of the clear opportunities because they will keep the forest standing. So we can see revenues are already important and it could be even more important. So this is what I had to say, this little overview about what is going on. And at the end, what happens in the cities has a consequence in the Arctic. has a consequence in those pollutants arriving there, and has a consequence on the use of the Amazon. So we all have some responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edenise, for this very enlightening talk about the specific Brazilian situation. I'm sure that Tony Hiss is very eager to talk to you. But first, thank you, the two of you. We go right to Charlie Duff's talk, and then last but not least, Marcus' talk, because the idea is getting together all these ideas to make our heads spin until the next year and gather momentum for a great conference in 2023. So please, Charlie, activate your micro and
activate my micro. I will try
yeah,
to share
it is activated. It's okay. Yeah, okay.
Good. Okay, let's get a slideshow going. Well, great. It is so wonderful to be in Porto Alegre again, even though I'm in the middle of Massachusetts where it's cold and it doesn't feel like Porto Alegre. It's so wonderful to look at you. When I think of why I love Porto Alegre, part of it is the beauty of the Guaíba, part of it is the food, most of it is the people I've met there, particularly the first person I ever met from there, Catherine Rosenfield, who is my guide to fascinating people and is a pretty fascinating person herself. This is just a delight, and I am delighted to be here. Tony and I worked out a little bit of what we would say together, and I was thinking of Tony's book. I really admire Tony's book. It's wonderful. Tony, of course, writes about how to rescue the planet by saving land, keeping land in wild use. And Edenise, my God, you have shown what's going to happen to us if we can't do this. If we want to preserve the beauty and the usefulness of the natural world, we have to deal with the population of the human world. That's a political reality, if nothing else. And as we've heard, and as I think by now we all know, the population of the world is growing more or less out of control. It may have hit 8 million day before yesterday. May have been 8 billion, sorry. It is scheduled to hit 11 billion by the end of this century. That's not going to be any better than 8 billion. That's going to be a lot worse than 8 billion. And if we want to save 50% of the land of the world, while our population is growing from too many to even more, we need to find a way that all of these people can live and still make room for nature to be nature on 50% of the land. This is not going to be easy. And my home country, the United States, is perhaps the epicenter of the problem. People from South America are always telling me that, North Americans are always telling you what to do. Well, we need you to tell us what to do. We need somebody to tell us what to do, because we are right now a big problem. The United States and China are the big problems in the world. And I think we in the 20th century were the most influential nation on earth. So I would like to claim credit that the United States is the biggest problem and the biggest cause of the problems that we are worried about. So if something is going to be done to solve the problems that we're talking about, it had better start with us, or at least it had better involve us. We're a big problem, and we need to become a big solution or a group of big solutions. At the center of it all for us is our pattern of living, which we Americans call suburban sprawl, or suburban sprawl in American English. Sprawl is when you're just spread out over the landscape. And here is an aerial view of perfectly typical modern America. Houses on half a hectare, swimming pools in the backyard, enormous roads, suburban sprawl. It eats land. How much land does it eat? Well, here are three big uses of land in the United States today. The biggest is corn or maize, then wheat, and lawns, which are the grass around houses. The grass around private houses is right up there with corn and wheat as a major user of land in America and as a major user of water. Lawns need to be watered, the same as cornfields and wheat fields need to be watered. Our carbon output per person is the highest in the world, 15.5 tons of carbon per person. Here are some national comparisons with the Netherlands, which is better, France, which is a great deal better. And if you expect us Americans to tell you what to do, you've got to tell us what to do. I'm sure you have all kinds of problems, but look at your carbon footprint compared to ours. You don't just have the pretty Guaíba, you don't just have interesting people like Catherine Rosenfield. You also have a serious modern country with a low carbon footprint. Keep it up, folks. That's pretty wonderful. I've recently seen a TED talk that I hope you will all see. I love it because it confirms everything I already believe, so that makes me a typical human being. Given by this fellow, Vishaan Chakrabarty, whom I don't know. He's not paying me to say this. How we can design timeless cities for our collective future. Well, that sounds like the title of a TED talk. That's pretty foamy. But what he's actually saying is quite interesting. He's saying, here we're going to have 11 billion people, and we need to house them in some way that does not eat land. And he's got a way to do it. And he says, if we follow his way, the Vishaan Chakrabarty way, we can put 11 billion people into an area the size of France. You wouldn't need Germany, Italy, or even Andorra. You could put 11 billion people into an area the size of France if you do things in the Vishaan Chakrabarty way. So you may be imagining Chinese megastructures with giant towers like Shanghai and Hong Kong. Well, Vishaan Chakrabarty knows what they're like, but he doesn't like them. He says there are three basic settlement patterns. On the left, you have American suburbia. See that little house all by itself? Even if you put solar panels on the roof, it's still a mess because it eats too much land. People have to drive cars. It's just a mess. Don't go there. So you may think that Vishaan Chakrabarty wants what you see in the middle. Let's all live in high rises like New York or like Beijing or something. But no, because it turns out, although high rises don't consume a lot of energy, they don't produce very much. If you put solar panels on the roof, you don't get much per person. Vishaan Chakrabarty recommends what you see on the right. 3-story houses made of wood and brick and other materials that you can take out of the earth sustainably. And he says, if everybody lived in 3-story houses with solar panels on the roof, or without solar panels on the roof, then 11 billion people could live in an area the size of France. The whole rest of the world could be boreal forest and polar bears. Do any such cities exist? Any Vishaan Chakrabarty ideal cities of 3-story buildings made of wood and masonry? Well, it turns out there are a lot of them. Here is the first of them. The 3-story, 4-story masonry attached house was invented in Amsterdam exactly 400 years ago, 1622. The first brick, what we Americans would call this a row house, the British would call it a terraced house. The Dutch, who invented them, would call it a house. It's the kind of house they had. 400 years, the Dutch have been building houses the way Vishaan Chakrabarty says we should all build houses. The Dutch aren't the only people who've been doing this. The British began to copy Dutch building almost immediately in the 1630s. And by 1670, most of London looked like Holland. Here's Bloomsbury, that's from the 18th century, but London has more of these Vishaan Chakrabarty houses, more row houses, more terraced houses than any city on earth. And in America, we too have cities of this kind. You're looking at a picture of Boston. I'm talking to you from Boston here today. This is around the corner from where I lived when I lived in Boston. We have in America cities that are like Amsterdam, cities that are like London, cities that are made of these, we call them row houses or terraced houses. Maybe we should call them Chakrabarty houses, but it's a long word. Boston is like this. My Baltimore is like this. I live in the city of Baltimore. And this is what I see when I walk out of the front door of my house every morning or every afternoon. Philadelphia is like this. San Francisco is like this, painted in funnier colors, but it is a Vishaan Chakrabarty city. These are cities with somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people per square mile. I'll translate that, that would be, 6,000 to 10,000 people per square kilometer. Yeah, I think that's right. I can't think in kilometers very well. But at any rate, we have cities like this, and the cities of Holland, the British Isles, and the Chakrabarty cities of America are what I've been studying for the last 10 years. I call them the North Atlantic cities because you find most of them on the two coasts of the North Atlantic, the European coast of the North Atlantic and the American coast of the North Atlantic. And you really don't find them in many other places. I find it useful when thinking about land and about carbon to compare three American cities. Let's start with this one, Houston. Houston is not on the North Atlantic. It doesn't look like Amsterdam. Vishaan Chakrabarty probably doesn't like it. I don't like it very much, although there's some nice people there. If you look at Houston, you'll see that it has a lot of skyscrapers in the middle, surrounded by almost nothing, surrounded by suburban sprawl. There's the center of Houston. It looks like New York. But as soon as you get out of the center, here you are. And the population density of Houston is extraordinarily low. This is a city of 7 million people, but its population density is 1,150 people per square kilometer. This is a whole city of suburban sprawl. And as a result, when people in Houston want to go somewhere, this is how they go. Can they take mass transit? Well, they have one mass transit line. This is a city of 7 million people. This is a city as big as Paris. It has one mass transit line. And even that's not underground. That is a slow-moving, low-capacity light rail line. When you have only 1,150 people per square kilometer, this is the best you can do. And you're going to be driving, and the polar bears will not be grateful to you. Unfortunately, most American cities are like Houston. Los Angeles is the one that everyone thinks of first. Los Angeles is actually the best of them, but it's not great. Denver, Dallas. Dallas is a catastrophe. Even Minneapolis. Minneapolis has the most interesting artistic and civic culture of any mid-sized city I know on earth. But it sure does use a lot of land, and the people sure do drive a lot. And the polar bears don't like it, and it's not good for Amazonia. So let's look at another city, New York. This is also an American city. You look at New York and you say, well, you don't have suburban sprawl in New York, and you certainly don't have suburban sprawl on Manhattan Island. When most people think of New York, they just think of Manhattan Island. And Manhattan Island does not have suburban sprawl. Almost 29,000 people per square kilometer, significantly denser than Paris. And so you would think, well, New York must be pretty green. Manhattan Island is pretty green. People walk a lot, although it isn't always good for their figures, apparently. And with densities like 29,000 people per square kilometer, you can support a good mass transit system. This is a map of the New York City subway system, or the metro, and it's a pretty good system. So should every American city be like New York? Well, maybe, but no American cities are like New York. No American cities are anything even vaguely resembling New York. And please take it from me, there's no way that we Americans can tear down all of our cities and rebuild them to be like New York. It's not feasible. Even if we tried to do it, the carbon footprint of building all of those new giant buildings would be crazy. So it wouldn't be a good thing to do, but that's okay because we can't do it anyway. No American cities are like New York. And besides, most of New York isn't Manhattan Island. If you get into the outer boroughs of New York, here is the Bronx. And do you want to live like that? Do you want the whole planet to be like that? Maybe you do. I don't. I think we can do better than that. Do you want the whole planet to look like that? Maybe you do, but I don't. And when you get out of New York City itself, you find where most of the people who call themselves New Yorkers actually live. New York City has about 8 million people. Metropolitan New York has about 20 million people. That means that most of the people who call themselves New Yorkers live in suburban sprawl outside New York City. This is an aerial photograph of a New York City suburban development called Levittown. And I think this photograph was taken in 1947. Tony, you may know. Tony lives in New York, and Tony may know this. It's about 1947. Might be 48, might be 49. At any rate, Levittown is still there. And if you live in Levittown, and millions of people live in neighborhoods like this, they call themselves New Yorkers, but this is how they live. Your density is extraordinarily low, so that on Manhattan Island, you have 29,000 people per square kilometer. But if you look at the whole conurbation of New York, if you look at all the people who say, I'm a New Yorker, 2,000 people per square kilometer. The polar bears don't like that. And this is a picture taken not in Houston, but outside. Well, actually, I think it's inside New York City. People drive a lot, even in New York. Not so much on Manhattan, but in metropolitan New York. So let's look at a third city, Washington. Washington is a city that we Americans sometimes love and sometimes live in mortal fear of. We had a pretty good election last week, so I'm loving Washington better than I usually do. But let's hope for the best. President Biden's a good man, I think, and we're having a good government. But let's not think of Washington as the American government. Let's think of it as a city. It is a city of about 5 million people, metropolitan area of about 5 million people. When you look at it from the air, you will see in the middle the official buildings and parks of Washington and the great obelisk of the Washington Monument. And you can probably see the Capitol with its dome. But what's all this stuff down at the bottom of the picture? Those are the houses of the people of Washington. They're not government buildings, they're not office buildings, they're not monuments. They're the houses of the people, and they look like this. Washington is a city of row houses, or if you're British, terraced houses, or perhaps in our talk, we can call them Chakrabarti houses. Some of them are quite fancy, quite delightful. Washington is a beautiful, wonderful city. And it is a city in the North Atlantic tradition. It's not like Houston. It's not like New York. There are beautiful streets in Washington. And if you live in one of these houses, you can have a nice house the way you do in Houston, but you can be close to a commercial area. The houses I just showed you a picture of are a 5-minute walk away from this good commercial area in the Washington neighborhood of Georgetown. So this is a good way to build cities. And I would suggest to you that this kind of a Chakrabarti way of building meets the 2 tests for sustainability in a city. The first test is, can you walk to shopping, restaurants, cafes, or do you need to drive a car? And in the North Atlantic way of building, in the Chakrabarti way of building, we pass that first test. Washington passes that first test. There's enough density for people to be able to walk to restaurants, shops, etc. The second test is, do you have enough density to support good public transport? Washington, I think, this is a map of the Washington Metro. Washington, I think, has the best transit system of any American city of its size. It fits Washington better than the New York system fits New York. It is a wonderful system, and it is achieved with much lower population density than New York. So here are our 3 cities compared with respect to population density. You'll see Houston is too low to be sustainable. New York is certainly high enough to be sustainable, but it's too dense to be possible. And then there's Washington, and Washington looks so much lower than New York, but it works. And it's something that we can actually do. We know how to do this. We have lots of cities that are like this. We know how to build them. We know how to live in them. You can get Americans to live this way, and you can make it work. And carbon, Houston's as bad as the country as a whole, 15 tons per person. New York's better. Washington's the best of the 3. There we are with the whole US. So America's North Atlantic cities are like Washington. So I've been studying the cities of the North Atlantic on both sides. I happen to like them, so perhaps I'm biased. But I think there is, in the middle of the mess of the United States, I think there is a way of living, a way of building, a way of doing cities that Americans already like. And if we can figure out how to do more of it, and we're doing a little more every year, that just might be good news for the polar bears and the Amazon. So if you can't be in Porto Alegre, you can be in a North Atlantic city. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Charlie, for this very enlightening talk about the challenges of changing cities. And now, last but not least, to Marcus Tomaselli, who will talk about his experience. Marcus, can you activate your micro?
I am activating. I activated my micro, and I will share my presentation. I hope you can see it.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So yes, that was a nice contribution now coming from the forest of Amazon and the Arctic to Washington. Now we do a step over the Atlantic Ocean and continue with Vienna. Vienna is one of those cities that are very similar to Washington in many parts, and it has a long history. I will give a short overview about the history of Vienna, its circumstances, its problems that it faced in the last decades, and how it nowadays develops and tries to implement urban living conditions that are adequate to people and somehow a little bit substituting the needs that are causing this urban sprawl that was mentioned already a couple of times. Of course, Europe as well faces this problem of urban sprawl, maybe not in that extension as the United States. And we have the lucky situation that many of our cities have been built in a period of time when energy was rare, expensive, and only available to very few people. So they are pedestrian friendly in many, many ways. The living conditions at that time, 1890s, end of 19th century, they have been really harmful to most of the inhabitants of big cities in Europe. And the substance, the building substance that we have in our cities is still somehow determined by constructions that have been built in that time in a very speculative way. But to understand a little bit the history of Vienna, we have to go back to the Romans and see where they built a castle at the Danube River. And we somehow slightly see the layout of the core of the city that appears nowadays in these linear drawings that are around the ancient fortification. In the medieval time, there was another fortification a bit far outside, covering more or less the core of the whole medieval city with its dome and the remains of the Roman settlement, which are still visible in the urban fabric, in the urban structure. At the end of the 18th century, they started redesigning the central area of Vienna with this rigid structure that is nowadays providing the spectacular boulevard of the Ringstraße with all the famous public buildings, somehow similar to what we saw in Washington, just in a circular configuration. And of course, with a lot of parks and so on. But this was not the residential Vienna of most of the people. This was the Vienna of palaces, the Vienna of the owners of the early industrialization, the early industry of Vienna, of Austria. And this is somehow the aerial view of this part of the city. What we can see here is that there is a lack of high-rise buildings. Lately, we got some more. You would see them here in the very end of the perspective at the other side of the Danube River. But let's say the city of the 19th century appears more or less this configuration as it is shown in this aerial view. Beside the green space that was more catering into the representative buildings, the Rathaus, the City Hall, the university or the parliament, or even the Emperor's Palace, this green space was in many, many parts not even accessible to the residents of the city itself. And Vienna is located not only at the Danube, but also at the end of the Alps, the beginning of the Carpat Mountains, which we see in the background, and along the Danube River. This configuration, just a short overview, caused a lot of problems, and these problems, but these problems still provide us a city that is a 15-minute city. The mayor of Paris, she proposed to configure her capital into a 15-minute city already based on this structure that was created by Haussmann in the 19th century, but still providing all the facilities within an accessible range of a 5-minute walk, 15-minute walk, or 5-minute bicycle ride. The advantage of these dense configurations that are not exactly the row houses or townhouses that have been mentioned before in Amsterdam or in some of the cities of the United States. These houses here, they are more speculative in their construction. They are way denser, and they are multi-story buildings of apartments, usually on one level. So no split level apartments or no maisonette apartments at all. But they provide, although they are placed in a very rigid grid and they face a lack of public space, they provide a lot of advantages. In their origin, the infrastructure, the technical infrastructure of these buildings has been very limited. Toilets have been shared by many people, even more apartments than just one toilet outside in the corridor. The running water was only provided in a few places in the building. The entrance situation was really, till the 80s, I would say till 1980s, really in a condition that needs improvement, as we can see. And the configuration of the floor plans shows the density of these structures. The courtyards usually have been built up, and there was no open space left, just a little bit for ventilation, a little bit for light, natural light, but no green space and no recreational qualities at all. But in sections, we see that the street, the courtyard, the souterrain, and even sometimes the first floor had worked together in a kind of semi-public open space that covered the needs also of a light or small economy in this city, and they still provide opportunities for multiple uses by the height of the ceilings and the dimensions of the constructions. Caused by these disastrous living conditions, in 1920s, the socialists, the social democrats, at that time socialists, started ruling Vienna after the First World War, and started a tremendous building program of some 100,000 of apartments, providing shelter for those living in these precarious conditions. One of the most impressive examples is this 1 kilometer long, 1,400 unit containing like a fortress of the workers' population, the Karl-Marx-Hof by Karl Eng. We see the apartments, they are still small, still limited. They have a toilet inside the apartment, but sanitary facilities like kitchen or bathroom have been in the courtyards and shared by the residents of this building. This was somehow also determined by the ideology, of course, of the socialists at that time. Another example is Karl Zeitzhof, one of the 2 or 3 biggest units that we have here in Vienna. But what we see here in this aerial view, the courtyards became green. First facilities like kindergartens and so on have been provided for the residents. And we have these 4 or 5 stories, usually as an accessible dimension, even without elevators at that time. Besides this movement to the super blocks, as they have been called, Vienna had also a movement of settlers. The settlers movement is very close to what we see nowadays in the global south as an informal developments around the cities or within the cities even. This was a very similar phenomenon caused by the collapse of the Austrian Empire, caused by the beginning of industrialization, caused by migration, mostly from rural areas to the cities. And these informal settlements have been adopted somehow by the city, by the administration of the city, and they tried to bring this movement into a somehow official process that was supported and also a bit steered by the city council. And some of those examples, like the settlement Lokkawiese, you see the huge green areas in between these small, tiny houses. These houses are coming much closer to the Amsterdam row houses that we have mentioned before. They also provided small gardens suitable for at least some plants growing there by the families. So you couldn't cover of all your needs, but you could somehow support yourself, your living, improve your living conditions by these gardens. Nowadays, they are not used anymore in that way, but still the green space is available. The conditions of the people in, especially in housing in this metropolitan area of Vienna, engaged a lot of architects of the modern movement in providing examples or providing proposals for low-income housing, but in a individual home system, so close to the settlement movement, and far away from the super blocks with this multiple-story residential agglomerations of 1,000 or more apartments. As you see this illustrious list of architects, all very famous at that time, all internationally active. Most of them, of course, had to move during the socialist, the National Socialist time, the Third World War, the Second World War, sorry, to England, America, or even to Sweden and Finland. They proposed a group of houses and exhibited these houses to the people of Vienna, to the interested community. Unfortunately, exactly in that period of time when the global economy collapsed. So a lot of visitors came, a lot of guided tours have been provided, but only a few houses could be sold. This movement didn't only happen in Austria. We have the same configuration, a similar one in Stuttgart and many other places in Europe. So this was an international movement, somehow trying to educate also the quality of individual homes for the people. After the Second World War, after the damages that Vienna faced, this dense historic constructions, the blocks that I showed before with these limited courtyards, this high density and this precarious conditions have in many places in Vienna been replaced by those what we nowadays see as modernist slabs, concrete slabs, all apartments facing south, all having a bathroom, all having a balcony, all having a parking space. These, for example, these buildings have been designed by an architect very famous at that time, Karl Aubeck, and we see that it is a very rigid structure following absolutely the rules of modernism, still somehow in an acceptable dimension, but providing all the facilities that are necessary to have a car-friendly and car-oriented city configuration. The apartments, of course, at that time in a technical standard that provided all the needs that have been missing in this historical situation. A few years later, when Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, the demolition of this modernistic neighborhood appeared and became part of the discussion and part of the architectural discussion all over the world. In Vienna, the focus changed, the paradigm changed, and a lot of engaged young architects demonstrated to provide or to to protect the old neighborhoods, to protect this really disastrous condition of building, to improve their quality, to improve the living conditions, because they could somehow see the quality of the spatial configuration, the quality of this neighborhoods, of these houses that are very close, bringing people together, provide accessibility by pedestrians without the need of cars and anything, any technical transportation. As a result of that, the city of Vienna integrated this movement and started a very careful documentation of the history of buildings, the uses, the ownership of buildings, and a process of regeneration started, which led to a totally different neighborhood. You see the same buildings that we saw before in this black and white picture as they appear nowadays, pedestrian friendly, a lot of restaurants, a lot of bars, and a lot of life on the street. In the same time, the city started to reconstruct the historical blocks, to lower the density of the internal courtyards, to provide more green space, to provide more densification by adding volumes on the rooftops, by providing modern new apartments on the existing structure. As we can see, for example, in this building, they added even 3 stories to the existing old one, and somehow increased the density of the neighborhood, as well as they provided the technical standard and the thermal standard that is necessary nowadays. These rehabilitation goals, they appeared in many districts, and I will show you in a few slides that really the majority of buildings in Vienna went under this process of reconfiguration. Courtyards like this have been transformed into courtyards like this. Unappropriate sanitary conditions, incredible density, deficit in ventilation and natural light have been brought into new concepts of pathways, pedestrian accessibility to the courtyard, and green space in the internal configuration of these neighborhoods. And as you can read, Vienna's social housing started in the 20s, and nowadays we have about 220,000 apartments in Vienna that are owned by the city of Vienna, and the rental paid and the amount of rent is controlled by the city council. As I mentioned, in 1984, approximately, the city started this rehabilitation program, and we are now dealing with about 250,000 of refurbished apartments. The core of the city is clearly visible. This is this lighter part with this historic origin of the city, and the dark red parts show those areas of the city that urgently needed an improvement in both the public spaces, but mostly in the quality and the conditions of the apartments and the buildings itself. To provide that, the city, and this is a couple of years later, you see already the process was very successful, and a lot of dark red parts moved into the light yellow ones. So the process was steered by the city council with a lot of fundings, of course, with a lot of administrative assistance, and with the invention of offices, usually run by local architects, that provided knowledge, that provided technical assistance, but also administrative assistance to both the owners of the buildings as well as the residents, and try to configure a situation that allowed the people, even if they have low income, to remain residents in the renewed neighborhoods and the renewed buildings. So you can imagine people living in this apartment building this is not a rich neighborhood. The density was high, the construction was tremendous, but nowadays it looks like this. And this is absolutely a state-of-the-art building with all the qualities that we nowadays are looking for in an urban, densely populated, but well-working neighborhood. I will just add a couple of examples more to give you an impression how this situation changed. And I would like to say thank you for your attention. And I hope I could give you an overview about the process that is still going on in Vienna to upgrade the historic city and to provide exactly those qualities and those conditions that avoid us to continue with the urban sprawl. Thank you very much.
Well, all of this, thank you very, very much, you four, a wonderful team. I mean, this was the right amount of alarming news which you brought, and then, you know, all of the solutions that can be found, which are really endearing, and the heart is lifted up again after being very depressed for a moment. So I would, if I may, I would just like to a very small question to each of you. Edenisi, how do you see Tony's idea of you know, saving half of the territory of the planet in the Brazilian context? And Tony, everything you said gave me the impression that there is this predisposition now in the US of people to you know, really adopt this idea. And then Charlie starts speaking and you get the feeling, no, this won't work, because you see all of these images where, you know, saving half of the territory is clearly not put into practice. So do you think that this is more on a conceptual level, your book Saving the Planet, or that this is something that can thrive on a bigger level? And for Charlie, I don't know, when you try to introduce into the American, the US context, this idea of the North Atlantic city, of building differently and living differently, and not using the car, and then you show us all these pictures. I mean, what are the practical challenges of changing the mindset for people not to, you know, for people thinking about public transport and not using the car? So I mean, the idea is great, but in the American context, what are the chances for this idea to thrive and work? And finally, Markus, how do you think that solutions that have been working wonderfully in Vienna, you know the Brazilian context, so where do you see the main challenges of making these new ideas feasible in Brazil, and particularly in Porto Alegre? So I don't know who starts. Edenisi, Tony.
Edenise, thank you for the presentation. You presented so much wonderful information with so much hope and optimism at its heart, despite the grim nature of things that have been happening. As to your question to me, Catherine, my book is written in the spirit of hope and optimism because I was able to survey dozens of projects all over North America that are underway already, even though this whole movement has been operating under the radar, as we say, up till now, just because people haven't yet focused en masse on the whole subject of how threatened biodiversity is. As I said, it's still overshadowed by the climate crisis, which itself is overshadowed by all the other crises that come up day by day. But nevertheless, this wonderful movement is underway. Charlie mentioned lawns, grass around people's houses as one of the principal land uses in the country on the scale of cornfields and wheat fields. But there's this wonderful movement called Homegrown National Park, which says that if we could convert just half of all those many millions of acres or hectares of lawn back into areas that promote native plants and that have homes for the pollinators, the bees and the moths and the butterflies, we could restore that functioning even to this landscape, which is so severely limited and to one use. So things are creeping ahead in some places and galloping ahead in other places. And that's excellent news. So I hope that we will find commonalities in Brazil and the US so that we can work together on these problems.
Thank you, Tony. Denise?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the Amazon biome specifically, keeping 50%, I think it's not an option. Because, tipping point for the Amazon, or the point where the biome, the ecoregion, will lose its characteristics, can be reached is supposed to be reached between 20–25%. So we are already almost there. If you keep only half of the Amazon region, and we are talking about more than 500 million hectares, that means that we are losing 250 million hectares. And if you consider all the carbon stored in that area, the amount of carbon released to the CO2 released to the atmosphere will be huge, and will feed those loopings of tipping points, starting from the Amazon and feeding CO2 to the atmosphere and feeding all the other cycles. So I think that would be really terrible in terms of environment, because the Amazon has a key role in terms of carbon, besides biodiversity, besides social diversity, has a huge role in terms of carbon storage. So it would be very risky. As an environmental scientist, I hope that won't happen. I'm really fighting to keep what we have and to regain through restoration the areas that we have lost so far.
Thank you. Marcos, Charlie. You have to put on your micro.
I do, sorry. Karin, you asked me about the possibilities that I see for similar developments, as I pointed out from Vienna in Porto Alegre.
For example, in the center of Porto Alegre,
Yeah, I think that Porto Alegre has a couple of examples that are somehow going in that direction a little bit. Close to the shopping center Praia de Belas, there is a neighborhood, not Moinhos do Vento, it is
Menino Deus.
Menino Deus, yes. You have some buildings there that are very close to with their qualities as an apartment building, but as a residential configuration at all, very close to what we see in Washington or what we see in some parts of Vienna. There is a lot of green space, there is a quality of public space, there is accessibility for pedestrians to most of the infrastructure they need for daily life. And you have other neighborhoods outside the historic city center, which also work in a similar way. What we have to continue, I think, is the idea that density and also revenue is not only possible with high-rise buildings, but also with this intermediate developments that allow us to access, even without technical infrastructure in all floors, in all stories, that allow us to create a public space that is under social control and accessible and usable for the people, not only by car, but also in other means of transportation. And here I see the biggest problem, the understanding that you can earn money by renting or selling, even in other dimensions than in 19 stories, identical flats into all directions. This is the biggest challenge I see in Latin America and many other countries in the global south, but also in many, many countries in Europe.
Thank you. Charlie.
Well, thank heaven I don't have to tell the people of Porto Alegre what to do. But I wish I could tell the people of the United States what to do. However, I think we're actually beginning to make some progress. Edenise, you scared the pants off me. Everything about your talk. I mean, none of it was new, but you put it all so brilliantly and all in one place. And I was thinking, oh my God, our goose is cooked. We are in real trouble here. And we are, and we've got to realize that. What we're doing in American cities, that I'm pretty optimistic about it, because for the last 100 years, Americans have been sprawling. And now that is beginning to stop. We're beginning to do something else. New York City has gained 1.5 million people in the last 30 years. It didn't need to build any new streets. It didn't need to build any new sewer and water lines to get all of those people. Boston has gained a couple of 100,000 people. That's about 30%. Washington has gained about 30%. Philadelphia and Baltimore are beginning to gain. San Francisco is gaining. These are all people who 50 years ago would have been sprawling out into the countryside, and now they're not. When I look at suburban development now, I see a lot of apartments and I see a lot of brand new row houses. The difficulty in America is twofold. One is we have probably 60%, 70% of our whole national housing stock was built after World War II, and it's sprawl. And what do you do with it? It's not going away. How do you make that green? And I'm up here at Harvard today with a bunch of planning students, and we're trying to figure that out. And it's a lot of fun. When we figure it out, I'll tell you. We haven't figured it out yet. It's a big question. Yeah, but
well, let's stop on this note. You will tell us.
Yeah, we'll tell you someday, probably in 30 years. But the other thing is, it's going to be very difficult for us Americans to make the big public investments that we need in public transport. Almost all American cities have very, very weak systems of public transport. Making them stronger is absolutely essential if America is going to do what America needs to do. And we're not there yet. We're not there yet. But when we have more people living at urban density, they will begin to demand it.
Okay. Thank you all very, very much. We will try to think of means to keep you connected over the next months.
Good.
So we can count on a much more intense cooperation and exchange for our Congress next year. I thank you all from my heart for being so kind and generous to have attended this preliminary meeting. Marcio tells me that we are over time now and that we have to stop. So this thing will be on YouTube, and we'll try to, I don't know, do subtitles or whatever. So we have it in 2 languages, or maybe we can publish your talks somehow. So that will be our task in the weeks and months to come. Thank you all very, very much. Thanks again to Marcio and the whole crew from CDEA, PUC URGS. And see you again very, very soon. Thank you for the brilliant talks.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure listening.
Good.
Pleasure to meet you too.
Good night from Vienna.
Goodbye. Good night. Yeah, it's very, very late with you.
Nice to hear in Porto Alegre.
Let's raise a glass.